Welcome all and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Michael Downey and it's great to be back for the final session in a series of webinars designed to assist growers who are dealing with the effects of recent bushfires. And in today's session, we'll take a look at training fire damaged vines and replants. These webinars were formed as part of the Vineyard Mapping and Assessment project created in response to the Cuddly Creek and Kangaroo Island bushfires. The project has been led by Wine Grape Council of South Australia and Primary Industries and Regions SA and was funded by the South Australian Wine Industry Development Scheme and approved by the Minister for Primary Industries and Regional Development, Tim Whetstone. The project has been supported by the following stakeholders: the AWRI, SARDI, Vine Health Australia, University of Adelaide, Adelaide Hills Wine Region and Rural Directions. Before we jump in and make a start though, a couple of quick reminders for the audience. To ask a question, open the Q&A button within your Zoom toolbar, type your question in and send it through. We'll be running a dedicated Q&A at the end of the presentation today, but please feel free to send through your questions at any stage. A reminder also that the webinar is being recorded and will be available to view via the AWRI's YouTube channel. Now, for those of you that have just joined, welcome. Today's session takes a look at training fire damaged vines and replants, and it's great to have Dr. Richard Hamilton back with us again to share some insights around this topic. Richard has extensive experience in viticulture, having spent 12 years with the Department of Agriculture, 12 years working as a viticulturist with what is now Treasury Wine Estates, before establishing Hamilton Viticulture back in 2010. Richard, thank you for joining us today. It's fantastic to have your expertise on hand, and if you're ready to go, I'll hand over to you to make a start.
Thanks very much, Michael. My remarks today are referring to the Cuddly Creek fire in the Adelaide Hills region, which occurred on Friday, December the 20th in 2019. My first slide, I'm just a few refreshers from last week. My first slide is just a schematic of a vine. And I have used a model that sort of is indicating where damage is occurring. Obviously, fire is requiring fuel, and we've got a situation where most of the fuel in this instance is on the ground, and you've got decreasing impacts as you move up from the ground, depending on the heat of the fire. Of course, as I talked about last week, fires can be highly variable. The conditions on that day were horrendous, to put it mildly, and we had a situation where side vines in particular, there was quite considerable damage. This is an example of a panel showing the level of damage. Clearly there's been burning through the interrow region, but you can see in this slide that there's been some material in underneath these vines here, as you can see I'm following my mouse, and you can see that this vine here has in fact not responded at all since the fire, noting that this was pruned shortly after the fire, and the debris that's showing here is leftover material from green material that was on the vine at the time of the fire. So this vine has not responded at all, whereas this vine here has actually shot and then found under the first warm conditions with the growth that was on top, came under stress because of the damage around the trunk region, and as a result has failed. This vine here, the closest to us, the trunk was clearly damaged, and you can see that there's been all the vigour of that vine has pushed through sucker shoots at the base. Just to take this a bit further for the future, this is a schematic drawn up of vine growth activity in the Adelaide Hills in a normal season. Dormancy can normally be considered as being between August, from June, July and August, sorry about that, and the growth season largely is from September through to May, depending on what seasonal conditions are like. In September, we've got a bud burst occurring and shoot growth occurring through until December. Flower initiation in the region normally starts around mid-December and through into January and possibly into February. At that stage, as a schematic, we then go into a cane maturation period and then begin carbohydrate storage for laying down material for the following season. The remarks I'm putting forward today relate to the Adelaide Hills region, and I need to just indicate that within the region, approximately half of the fruit is actually going out is contracted fruit and is going out to wineries for purchase. And the other half is for own wineries, and that has a significant impact on how you might manage a fire damaged vineyard. The recommendations that I'm making today are targeting best viticultural practice to meet contract specifications. So in other words, I'm dealing with what is required for contracted fruit, where specifications are quite specific for its end use. I do want to make the comment, of course, that for own wineries, because they have a fair degree of flexibility, they may have the ability to manage small batches of fruit, and they can properly manage greater vineyard variability. And so some of the recommendations I'm making may seem fairly severe, but this is about making sure that you've got blocks that will work into the future, something that I will be mentioning many times during this discussion. If I take this schematic now and then impose on this what the impact of fire damage is. So we're having the fire here on the 20th of the 12th at a period when we should be nearing the end of shoot growth and beginning flower initiation. What's happened is you've had a moderately rapid bud burst. It's happened over a period of 2 weeks as opposed to the long slow bud burst that might occur in cooler conditions in a normal season, and then gone on to shoot growth. The point I'm wanting to make with this particular schematic is that there hasn't been enough time for full development of the vine because we've had damage occurring in December and we're having an impact of going towards dormancy. So main shoot growth was occurring between February and April, and this, with the variability that we're seeing in the region now, we've actually indeed had a very cold April and a significantly cold May, and this is starting to impact quite strongly on shoot growth. For example, the leaves at the present moment, because of the cold that we've been experiencing over the last 2 weeks, the proximal leaves are really basically not functioning anymore, and flower initiation is affected as well. One comment that was made last week is managing trunk disease, and I'm kicking myself that I didn't actually refer to it in my first seminar. I did make the comment that I'm dealing with best practice, and I made an assumption which was incorrect. And basically, one must be dealing with managing trunk disease issues for the future. In my slides, I did show that there had been very close attention because I think the Adelaide Hills have picked up trunk disease is a real issue throughout the region, and people have picked that up and have been very careful to make sure that they're providing a barrier. So recommendations in relation to managing trunk disease are to use a barrier, and that includes a paint and or a fungicide, or using biological compounds. Trichoderma is the biological in this instance. The paints can be either just plain acrylic or acrylic with chemicals added to it. This table is from work from Mark Sosnowski and is available on Wine Australia. In terms of dealing with the issues in relation to that protective barrier, which is essential, the barrier should be monitored for its first 2 weeks and replenished if there's any sign of weeping or cracking. The recommendations I'm going to be making today will involve making pruning cuts, quite significant pruning cuts into winter. Now, it's not until you leave them until early spring when weeping may occur that you may need to be aware of this. But I think as best practice, keep an eye on the cuts that you've protected, making sure that they are still functional. For example, you may have had a heavy rain shortly after painting process. Another refresher again, what I was contrasting in this particular slide is reminding people that it's, you may lose the upper part of the vine, but you've really got quite a substantial area of root system, which is pushing to move up through, provide its vigour for re-establishing the vine. And I was contrasting that with the use of rootlings and contrasting just how much is available, the value of that root system if you can make use of it. And in this schematic, just showing that when we cut back hard, which I'm recommending in some instances, you've got this whole root systems pushing up into a very small area in contrast to what you would have in a normal rootling. But that's a significant advantage to re-establishing the vineyard, which is something for the future. So in retraining aims, we need to remember that we're building a vine structure for at least 30 years. That's the way we tend to look at vines commercially, but of course we do have vines that are lasting 50 plus years. We really need to bear that in mind, that we are building something that is providing an income for the future, as well as that fascination of wine production and being able to build brands, etc. Ideally, trunks that are developed should have an average internode length greater than 10 centimetres. I suspect that we're going to see with a lot of push happening, but the reason I make that comment is that if vine growth is very, very weak and you're ending up with more than 10, 15 internodes getting to the wire, that's something that should be of concern. In terms of cordon head establishment, we aim to have deep V's to ensure open crowns for old vines. This image is showing some vines that are around about 30 years old, and you can see that there's been an issue in terms of tight wrapping onto the wire, as well as the lack of a crown. And as a result, you can see that we've got a lot of loss of shoots, a loss of active growth, and loss of spur position through to dying of tissue and absolute choking. And you can see in this instance, this is down in Coonawarra, you can see in this instance that there's been attempts to replace the growth here, but because there's no crown in through here, there's a lot of damage, and that's just not being successful. So urging that you look for open crowns. In terms of what the long-term aim is, in the initial stage for both cane and spur pruning, you're just simply looking to fill the wire. But if you're planning to have be spur pruned in the long term, internode distances should allow upward pointing spurs every 10 to 15 centimetres or a hand width between them. I'm suggesting that you remove all downward pointing shoots early. Removing shoots early is minimising damage at the internode point and providing its ability to recover and provide a long-term cordon for the future. I'm going to keep harping at applying loose wrapping to reduce wire binding. This slide is from some vines down at Langhorne Creek, and what we've done is to use a chainsaw to actually dissect where live tissue is. The live tissue in this particular vine is the white coloured material. And as you can see from the dissection, you've got dead brown tissue here and stained tissue for where fungal growth has occurred in the woody tissue that's damaged. But the point of this slide is that you can see the wire has been totally incorporated into the vine. And they really have a restriction problem in terms of movement of water and nutrients through the vine, and is not something that's desirable in the long term. And to that end, and I'll be more on this, consider use of tape guns to help reduce those tape wrapping issues for the future. We need to manage vigour, and bearing in mind that we've got a whole root system, particularly if we've cut back heavily, we've got a whole root system pushing through one or two nodes, and that can be to great advantage. And what we're looking to do is to rapidly establish an even vine structure throughout the vineyard. If you've got strong regrowth, then I'm suggesting you try the strongest leader to the wire, or if you've got enormous vigour, you may need to consider actually using two leaders at least. This is some very well grown stuff, that vines that were cut back probably about 2 to 3 weeks after the fire, and you can see there's been quite a considerable growth, perhaps not quite much as a full vine, but something fairly close to it. So if you think about the root system underneath these vines, they have a lot of push that needs to be managed. My suggestion is that you select the best placed shoots in this instance to establish the cordon, or shoots indeed to manage the vigour. And you may in fact just choose a shoots to get your cordon, and then perhaps leave some shoots at the base to try and absorb the vigour that's involved. From that leader, I'm suggesting that you take the 2 shoots to train for your permanent arms, but perhaps even consider taking 2 or more shoots, so long as they're not too far down the trunk, and train them vertically on the foliage wire. They will keep growing. Hopefully those that you've trained on the foliage wire for the cordon will be inhibited and establish good, solid arms. I'm suggesting that you disbud lower shoots on the leader very early. The reason for that is that it minimises damage at the internode point, maximising the transport capacity of that vine in the future. Once the wire is filled, I'm suggesting you tip those cordon shoots, leaving one gap from the adjacent vine space so that you've got things set up for spur pruning if required, but also it allows to, for cane pruning vines, allows to allow other shoots to grow and provide nutrients and storage back to the vine base for the future. In a situation of weak regrowth, I'd suggest perhaps considering using manures and compost. This vine is something that's in the same vineyard as I showed from the strong regrowth, and you can see there's not been a lot of activity that's occurred. It's still growing quite healthily, but it has struggled. A word of caution, I'm suggesting that your manures and compost can be used as required for varieties for white and sparkling wine production, but I do suggest caution for red production, as it takes vines 3 to 5 years to return to balance, and we tend in Australia to be growing those vines under a fair degree of restriction in order to produce the quality we're after, and I have had experience of overfeeding, particularly Shiraz vines, and ending up not having them meet quality specifications because they're just simply too vigorous. In a weak situation, I'm also suggesting, particularly in forming your cordon, that you may have to take up to 2 years to build the optimum vine structure rather than targeting yield early or trying to fill the wire. The worst case scenario, if the vigour is not there, is that you end up with you don't end up with continuous bursting of buds along the cordon, and you end up with uneven spur positions, and that's not a good thing for the future. So in that instance, ensure that if you're having to going into winter without full wire fill, then select your wood to the point where it's pencil thick and that all the spur positions are burst. This will help build that structure in the long term. In terms of the training program, it's essential to get back into production as soon as possible, but equally, we cannot risk any check in vine development through physical damage or indeed disease and pest issues. In terms of physical damage, you don't want to be in a situation where any wind has occurred or tractor passes that have actually broken off any shoots. You want to capture every bit of that material as soon as possible. And here's an example of a vine where a shoot has come away from the base. It's been cut back heavily. And as you can see, it is the string is up in this position here. As you can see, it's deviated substantially away from the vine position, but it's held in place so that until that joint firms up, it is in position and providing is not likely to be lost during training. For training, in order to achieve those 2 or 3 weeks, if the area that's been damaged is large enough, I'd suggest that you look to try and maintain a training gang and have that gang just simply cycle through the vineyard throughout the training season. So go through a pass and then have to go back to the, where they started, hopefully 2 to 3 weeks later, then capture all that growth. This is particularly important early in forming the structure, and you may perhaps reduce that cycling once you get through to January, February. In terms of training trunks, urge the use of being careful of choking disease and use of strings, for example. Some people use wires, but there's a lot of work involved in that process. But with your strings, there's an opportunity, if you've got stumps there, to nail them or screw the string to the stump and then firmly tied to the wire. Don't be tempted. It frustrates me enormously in new vineyards to find that people have actually tied to the growing point and forgotten that that's going to choke it for the future. And again, I'll just reinforce, consider using the use of tape guns. You can see in this instance, rather than winding around the string, you've allowed the vine to develop its joint with where it's shot away from the trunk and harden that up, and then it can be pulled back hard into position. In your training program for training arms and cordons, recommending loose wrapping, as you saw from those diagrams of choke vines previously. Use the tape guns to hold loosely wrapped canes. This is actually showing a trunk being formed. This is an advertisement for one of the tape gun types from Europe. And you can see that you've got a lot of flexibility in terms of that wrapping process. And I'm suggesting for your arms and cordons that the aim should be to re-wrap the following winter, unwind it and then wrap it again to reduce future wire binding and to be at least a lot looser in your binding than we have been in the past or tended to promote in the industry to date. In terms of vigour management, obviously you're not going to have every vine the same, so treat individual vines according to their vigour, trying to get them as even as possible in the long term. I'm suggesting that once your arms are laid down, perhaps train additional shoots. Tipping the end of those shoots will force laterals to grow, and those laterals may in fact develop enough fruit to be worthwhile for the following season. If you've got enormous vigour, I would suggest considering allowing suckers to sprawl to slow upper growth. And if you're doing that, perhaps then to remove them in mid-November before the shoots begin to stabilise. By that I mean when they start to vascularise, start to firm up, and actually require more than a cut in order to remove them. But the beauty of that process is that it's sacrificial. It allows you to get your spur positions evenly spaced and provide something that's a support for the long term. I have previously been making the comment that you don't want to remove shoots during the growing season. This is when vines were damaged by fire, but in this instance I think it's well worthwhile doing, particularly if you can get that done before December. I'm also suggesting you consider summer pruning and removal of sacrificial shoots before full lignification. This is going to allow the wounds to repair themselves and not create an entry point for trunk disease into the future. In terms of vine health, spray programs must cover all growth. Normally in our management systems, clearly we're spraying all the green material from the crown upwards, but in this instance we may have green tissue from ground to the upmost growth, and the spray program should be aimed to cover that. We cannot risk the loss of any active leaf in this process. We're trying to recover from fire damage. We're trying to get that vineyard up and established as soon as possible. You simply do not want to be losing anything to disease pressure. I suspect disease pressure in these vineyards is going to be very high because there was clearly so much for people who are affected in Adelaide Hills region. They just simply didn't make the time or have the time to go through and provide protectants. And as a result, there's some very rampant infections of powdery and downy mildew, creating enormous spore reserves, which are going to be a problem in the future. I'm suggesting that a regular protectant program be applied throughout the season because it's likely that you're going to have new growth present for most of the season and you're wanting to encourage every bit of that growth to remain, to put nutrients back into the carbohydrates back into the vine so they can come away strongly the following season and develop any flowers that have formed or buds that have formed into flowers and fruit for the following season. There's also a need to monitor closely for insect activity, particularly the beetles, earwigs and weevils, which would love the beautiful fresh tissue coming away, particularly down low from vines that have been beheaded, and also keep awareness for vine moth. Vine moth is probably most likely to start to appear in terms of damage from December, January, but you simply do not want to be losing any of that green tissue that you've put all the effort into to establish over this time. Options for replacing missing vines. This is really a vexed issue. Clearly, if you've only got mild damage, how do you manage the differences between fully established vines and being able to fill those misses? We want to be able to reduce percentage wire fill, but we need to be careful that putting in a different population, for example, doing some replants in a partly damaged vineyard is a real issue because you're requiring different management regimes, which is going to add costs, and you're going to be needing vines of similar vigour for the future. There becomes the issue of differential ripening and meeting quality specifications, and this is a real issue that's critical for winemaking, particularly for contract vineyards. There are exceptions, of course, because some small wineries can have vineyard selections, which can be very attractive to clients, but across the board, really, we should be looking for evening ripening where possible. So the options we have are layering, which I'll go into in detail, but there are other options that are possible. One is the use of wire vines. I haven't seen this happening for some time and spoke to some nurserymen and they're not seeing it either. But basically what this involves is to actually take rootlings and grow them up to the wire and provide them with that trunk for future. This was a great process when the booms in the 90s that we used to use and was basically useful for vineyards less than 5 years old. So I'm sorry, I've gone too far forward. I'll just get back out of that. Whoops, I've done it again. I don't recommend that process at this stage. Another alternative is to consolidate rows through replanting. I've seen that done effectively, but of course it's most useful for vineyards of high value. The value of that process is that you consolidate rows that are established, being very careful and high cost to remove those vines and then replant a different section. But again, I suspect that's really only of value for high value vineyards. So the option really is layering. So look, layering as a process, it's an effective means for replacing adjacent misses. And this diagram is from the 1992 viticulture textbook and is basically showing the basics of layering, i.e. taking a cane from a established vine, growing it over a year or two, depending on the level of vigour, then being able to take that material and push it down underground 30 centimetres deep, and then train it up. In this instance, these days, we recommend that you actually have a length to be able to tie it to the wire to minimise potential loss of that material. The costs are around about $5 per vine, and the beauty of that process, plus training passes of course, and the beauty of the process is that once that vine is established, it will very rapidly develop to the stage where it's got similar sorts of vigour and ripening attributes to adjacent vines, and a good way to fill up the vineyard. So the process that I'm suggesting in this instance is that you select canes and train them along the drip wire. It may be a 1 or 2 year process, because you're looking to establish sufficient length to be able to then bury that cane in the next vine position to a depth of 30 centimetres and then tie that back up to the cordon wire. So the process that you're using then is to dig that, once you've got the canes available in the winter that you're going to start layering, dig a 30 centimetre deep hole, then crack the cane to bend it. This is a bit like sultana growers used to do in the old days. So basically you grab at each node, just bend it until it cracks slightly and bend that whole section from where it's bending down into the ground, bottom of the trench and then back up again. This has a dual purpose of making sure you don't actually snap the cane that you're trying to preserve, but also encourage root formation. This needs to be then pegged down with a cane with a U-shaped wire and then fill the hole with composted soil and tamp down. I was intrigued to read in the 1992 documentation, the textbook, that the recommendation was to actually wrap a wire around the what's called the nurse part coming away from the original vine, and with the idea being that as that grew in size, it would actually choke it off so that you don't have any nutrients going back to the vine. I'm not sure that's needed these days. Here's an example of some vines that were a vineyard that was managed back in the early 90s in the Clare region. And you can see this is 3rd or 4th year. You can see the trunk is starting to become quite strong. In its size, the nurse is starting to, this nurse section coming through here, is starting to reduce in vigour. You can leave that for the long term. Tidy vineyard managers will probably want to cut it away, but if it's not doing any harm, I'd leave that in position. This is a shot from some work that Murray Leake did with Shaw and Smith that was reported in Wine Australia material, and is basically showing that the opportunity that we can apply to vineyards that are fire damaged this year. You can see in this instance basically what's happened is been the cut back and a shoot taken and to provide a vine nearby. And you can see just how quickly you've got a situation where you've got something of a similar vigour adjacent. And certainly in a vine like this, there's plenty of opportunity. Take your upmost shoot, strong shoot, train that up, and then begin to train a sucker along the wire so that perhaps you can begin to start layering the following year. Perhaps with something slightly weaker, and this is an interesting shot because you can see this has got red cane material, and this is actually from suckers that have come from below ground. You can see the juvenile leaves. In this instance, you may want to reserve and just use a single shoot, but you may want to make use of it in the future. Just a quick note that I'm strongly suggesting that you make sure that your lowest shoot is the one that's trained up. And if you're looking to layer, that you pick a shoot, an upper shoot for later on. In the layering process, over time, this is from vineyards in Victoria in the 2010s. You can see that the process is very useful. In this instance, a vine has been used to establish 2 layers nearby. In this instance, a cane has been taken from the end of the cordon, pushed down and given a vine in this position, and then a weaker cane has been taken and brought in closer. So if you've got the vigour, then you can very rapidly fill these spaces in adjacent that are missing, and this may be a 2 to 5 year program depending on the vigour that's available. And here's an example where there wasn't enough vigour in the vine in this position, so a shoot was taken from the vine next door and moved 2 positions across. And this shot just reinforces that when you take that nurse cane to actually then use some potting soil to encourage root growth to get that up and going as quickly as possible. Just go back to, and this is a replanting option if all else has failed and you really do have to go through your replanting. Just a reminder that it didn't matter at what stage you cut back, you're probably going to be getting a full crop in year 3, 2023, and it probably takes 5 years to get to replant. And this is going to apply where the vineyard has been previously unprofitable, or is too badly damaged, or has had past trunk disease issues, and perhaps that's the time to get into replacing it, particularly if it's a variety that's not as desirable. It's going to be 2 to 2.5 years behind cutback options, but it does offer opportunity for optimal clone variety selections and also a fresh start for trunk disease management. Gives you a chance to order 1-year-old rootlings for 2022 planting. Gives you a chance for 1 year's fallow, 2 chances to remove old roots over 2 winter periods, use of cover crop and soil preparation, etc. All ideal for the long term. In those replanting options, I'm hearing a number of people have been talking about the potential of using planting callus cuttings. I would strongly recommend against it. I have spent way too much time as a consultant dealing with arguments over this sort of situation. This vineyard was established with callus cuttings. There's been some success. There's been 1 and 2 years of trying to replace vines later. The vineyard is a mess, a very difficult one to manage. My suggestion is let the specialised nurseries manage the risk that's involved and provide you quality rootlings. To establish your rootlings, you're having to callus vines, and what you're looking for is providing that heat to provide callus to develop. That callus will then develop into roots. The trick is to then plant that material without knocking that callus or the root primordials off. It is a very difficult process. If you are going to your nursery, make sure you include 5% for replants, and you'll be looking at for planting in 2022 with high quality material. Other options, of course, are to use potted vines. The issue with that is, of course, is that has to be established in the year of planting. You're planting that very, very late, which is a concern with these sorts of extremes in weather that we're seeing more and more often, and it really does make life difficult. And what I'm trying to do in this particular image is show the comparison in terms of the root systems between these 2 options. And then, of course, there's callus cuttings. I couldn't make this small enough to show the process, but I think you get the point of the exercise. It's worth taking that extra year to make sure that you get your vineyard 100% established. So in summary, I want people to remember that they're rebuilding for at least 30 years into the future, that the aim is to minimise variability in vineyards, rehabilitate after fire damage. It's critical to be applying best practice throughout the process. This includes all aspects: trunk disease management, pest and disease programs, nursery orders, etc. Layering to fill gaps is probably the process to help make up for where you've got missing vines. and it's a 2 to 5 year program depending on the severity of the damage that's occurred in the vineyard. And if replanting, I recommend that you use 1-year-old rootlings to ensure 100% establishment. That ends the formal presentation, and if I can hand back to you, Michael, if there's any questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Richard, for coming in and presenting today. Richard's going to stick around for a little while to answer any questions you may have. So this is your opportunity. Start sending them through. Just a reminder to ask a question. Open the Q&A button in your toolbar, type it in and send it through. The chat function is also enabled today. So if you want to use the chat function, that's fine also. We have had one question come in while you were presenting, Richard, and it's around, so the question is, you mentioned revisiting newly cut trunks for a couple of weeks to check the wound dressings. Do you see this as being a necessary step for the trichoderma method?
Use a catch-all and it serves me right. The idea for the wound dressing is where you're relying on that barrier to provide protection. With trichoderma, provided the injection or the process that you've used, the plug that you've used is active, you should be under a protection situation. So I don't think that's required. I am actually just referring to making sure that if you haven't got trichoderma there, that you have made sure that that wound has been covered, so that there cannot be any chance of spores landing and developing.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Hopefully that's answered your question, Lee. If not, send through a follow-up. We don't have any other questions at this stage, Richard. Wait a little bit longer to see if any flow through. The AWRI doesn't currently have any confirmed or advertised sessions or webinar events just at the moment, but there is one that will be due out shortly. We'll be running a pruning style tutorial session in early June. I don't have a date as yet, but it looks like it will be in early June, and it will be presented by Nick Dry from Foundation Viticulture. So just keep an eye out for any updates around that session. Best way to do that is probably visiting the AWRI website. Richard, doesn't look like we're going to get any further questions or comments regarding this session. Did you want to follow up with anything final before we start to wrap up?
No, all I'd be doing is just reinforcing what's going through the process. But this presentation has addressed roughly 1,000 hectares of the 3,000 hectares in the Adelaide Hills wine region. Some of that 1,000 hectares has not been badly damaged, and people may not need to apply the level of approach that I've been recommending here. But throughout, it's about looking at the variability that you end up in the final vineyard, and that really does need to be carefully thought through in the process.
Okay, thanks, Richard. While you've been speaking, we have had a final question come through, and it's around what you imagine the financial threshold would be for retraining versus replanting. Do you have any comments around that one?
Yes, look, I do. I think this is about how much of the vineyard you need to be in full production. And if you see a situation that layering is not going to allow you to get to that gold standard, which is probably 95%. The other issue is, and I was very pleased to have calls probably 2 and 3 weeks after the fires late at night from growers who'd been thinking about the damage that occurred, and discussions that we had that said, look, this vineyard is badly damaged. It's going to cost me a lot to replace. The variety that I've got in there is not really giving me a good return. perhaps I should think of this as an opportunity for getting into a new variety and making the vineyard more profitable. So look, I think the financial threshold is about what you are willing to accept in terms of vine misses, for example, what you're willing to accept of the impact of the level of trunk disease you have. Obviously, we have methods that can remove trunk disease, and of course this involves the same sort of process, beheading those vines and restarting again. And again, some of those late night calls have been along the lines of, look, I did have a Utipa disease problem in this instance, and here's a great opportunity for me to actually be able to then deal with that Utipa problem very, very quickly. And that's an important aspect to deal with from this process.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for addressing that final question that came through. I think we'll wrap the session up there. So I'd like to first extend a big thank you to Richard for providing some really key insights around this topic. Richard's contact details are there, and I'm sure he's happy to be contacted post-session should you have any follow-up queries. I'd also like to thank the audience for logging in and participating in today's session. For everyone that did attend, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this webinar. This was the final session for this series of webinars. As I mentioned, we do have another session planned for early June. So please keep an eye out on the AWRI website for details around that session. Thank you again for participating, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.